Okay, so let's move into the ethical systems. This is the last bit. Well, we actually have one more little bit after this on like the philosophy side of things with ethics, and then we'll be getting into the part of the course I get a little more excited about, where we get to interact with the scriptures themselves, but we're still kind of on the front end introducing everything here for now. And ethical systems, if you remember, we said these are just basically ways of thinking about morality. Specifically, ethical systems are ways of determining whether a thing is moral. So that catchphrase that we said earlier was moral reasoning. And as we'll introduce here in just a second, there's a lot of different ways to categorize ethical systems, and we're going to spend most of our time with one specific category, but we do need to introduce at least a few. They're important in the textbook for the course. For sure, for Scott Ray, he covers non-cognitive and cognitive systems. And there's only one non-cognitive system that we're going to cover, so I'm not going to spend too much time there. But all the other systems that we're going to be discussing for the rest of the semester really fall under that second category there of cognitive systems. And the big difference is non-cognitive says basically there's no such thing as morality, and cognitive system says, well, yes, there is. Even though they don't necessarily agree on what makes a thing moral under those cognitive systems, they at least agree that there is some kind of, moral truth out there, whatever that might be. But as we go through these systems, I want you to think about what your particular belief about ethics might be. And when we address these, there's a pretty good list of them here. Just be thinking about which one matches your view of ethics, or maybe which two or three match your view of ethics. What you might find is that one particular system doesn't exactly fit your views, so you might want to borrow some from here or there. And not only, don't just think about which one you like, be thinking about why you like this particular system or that particular system or combination. So keep that in the back of your head as we move forward here. But let's cover this non-cognitive system. And you see that definition. These are ways of thinking about morality that deny morality and ethics as anything more than just an opinion or, like an inclination that something may be right or may be wrong. And the one system we're looking at here is emotivism. And you can kind of guess at the definition of the term by just the actual term itself. This kind of system basically argues that ethical statements are just emotions, and they are kind of masquerading as facts. So when people say that is something that is wrong, or that's something that you should not do or you cannot do, the argument from emotivism is, well, no, you can't say that like it's a fact because it's just your opinion. There's actually no such thing as right or wrong. And so they argue that instead of saying that's wrong, we really should be saying, I don't like that, or I don't think that's good, instead of making the bold claim that this thing, regardless of the time and situation in which it is done, is always bad. Or maybe not even that. Maybe just this particular thing in this particular moment was a bad thing. They say, well, it's actually, there's no way to say that it was bad because there's no way to measure that. And so it's we can only say that it's just something we don't like or something we don't prefer. Now, arguments that are usually made in favor of this kind of view of ethics are basically most moral inclinations are simply emotions, because a lot of times our moral ideas or our moral convictions do carry a lot of emotion behind them. When you feel like something is wrong and you see it being done, you usually have an emotional response to that. So they argue, well, that feeling that you get shows you that it's mostly just an emotion. There's no actual, like truth or standard behind it. It's just something that we feel. Another argument for is that if we don't have a moral standard that is an objective moral standard, then we are free from all the pressure that we get from ethics. And so this is, an idea like this is pretty popular in a postmodern kind of a setting. And I know postmodern can have a lot of meanings here, but what I mean here is like pluralistic, or the idea that truth is relative, that we'll cover a little more in just a second in the relative system altogether. But a lot of that is here too. Truth is relative. It's just based on your emotions for the most part. And because of that, how great is it according to this view? Now, this is not my view I'm saying here, but the argument is, how great is it that we don't have the pressure of some kind of universal morality? You can do whatever you want as long as it feels right. The only moral compass you should have is what feels right to you. And for a lot of people, that's very liberating, and they really like that idea on the front end, and it does sound good in a lot of ways, but there are some arguments against emotivism, and some pretty tough ones. The first one, well, these really all kind of go together, but they're just emphasizing different sides at the same point here. Verification theory here is just basically, how do you know a thing is true? How can you verify something? Emotivism argues that because we don't have any empirical proof for morality, then it can't be something that's actually true. And this kind of gets into some weird territory of, we mentioned in the last lecture towards the end when we were talking about worldview, remember we brought up epistemology, or that was the fancy word for it. We brought up knowledge and truth as that key element of a worldview. Well, with this system of ethics, the idea is that the way you define truth in the sense of something that's like an unchanging, constant reality, the only way you define that is by like scientific empirical proof. So can you put it in a test tube? Can you measure it? Can you point to it and say, this right here is what I'm talking about? Taste it, touch it, feel it, that kind of thing. So emotivism says, since we know truth through, touching, seeing, tasting, the five senses, these kinds of things, you can't do all that with morality. Like, you can't put morality in a scientific experiment and point to it and say, there it is, you can touch it, you can feel it, you can hear it, all these things. And so they say, because that's the case, morality is not actually like a universal truth. It's just an emotion. It's like any other emotion. But if that's the case, the problem with making that kind of claim is it's a little bit self-defeating, because you cannot empirically prove the fact that only empirically proven statements have meaning, right? You can't put that statement itself in a test tube and say, see here, you can touch it, you can taste it, you can feel it, you can see it, that this is true. No, you have to use reasoning to arrive at that kind of conclusion, which leads to the second point. Emotivism sets up this, it only gives you two options. It's like morality has to either be a scientific fact that you can measure and observe in nature, which actually you can do. C.S. Lewis made the argument from really sociology. He looked back at a history of humanity. We'll get to that in a moment, but he argues that you actually can see a shape of morality across human history. But emotivism says, look, it either has to be something that you can taste and see and smell and all these things, or it must be just a worthless expression of feelings. And there's no room for anything in between, which is kind of, extreme on one side or the other. And it doesn't leave any room for a truth, what we can call like a truth of reason, which is basically what we said a moment ago, like this phrase of the emotivism maintains that the only empirically proven statements are those that have meaning. That in and of itself is a truth of reason. Like you cannot quantify that in data somehow to prove that it's right. You just raise all the evidence and you use your reasoning to determine that yes, this thing is true. And morality, we would argue, is just like that. Moral truths are truths of reason. You might not be able to put them in a test tube, but you can absolutely observe that they exist. And we're going to get to that in a moment. Actually, in the next little lecture on a case for objective morality, we'll get to it. So now let's move into the cognitive systems here. these are those that do accept some kind of moral truth. Now, there's not always agreement on what that moral truth is, but there is agreement that there is a moral truth that we should be trying to follow. And there's two categories here, subjective and the objective ones. And obviously, subjective are those that kind of change from situation to situation or person to person, depending on what the standard is there. And the objective truths or the objective systems say, no, there is a single standard that you have to meet at all times in any given situation. And we'll say a lot more about this in the next lecture. But for now, let's just go through these systems. Relativism. You can figure out what that is by the definition. This argues that morality is relative to individuals and their communities, or individuals on the one hand, and maybe on another, entire communities. There are true standards of morality, but there is no universal standard over all of the different moral truths. So, relativism teaches us that, simply put, one country or one person can hold to a different moral truth than another and be totally justified in their moral truth. So my moral truth might be different from yours because I experience reality differently than you. So morality is relative to our experience of truth, which is kind of a big statement to make there, but I think you get the point behind relativism here. Arguments for relativism, it's argued that, hey, values are created and they are affirmed within cultures. So there is freedom for individuals and for cultures to set their own rules for what's best for them. And it's also argued that this gives us freedom, just like the last one, emotivism. We are free from, the rigid, what's often viewed as oppressive weight of objective morality. You don't have to do this at this time. And the last thing is, it's argued that this actually encourages diversity and tolerance. If you believe this way, I believe that way, that's fine. You have your moral truth, I have my moral truth, and we can all live in harmony together, understanding that morality is something that's just relative anyway. So there's no reason to get all upset about someone else's views or actions, because there's really no standard that we can rightfully hold somebody to, because after all, our views of morality are just our own. But there's a lot of arguments against this. The first one is that in some cases, so this first argument for up here, and you guys can't see my cursor, I know, but I'm hovering over that. Values are created and affirmed within cultures. That's not an argument that just, hey, this is a better thing to do. That's a statement of a fact. They argue, or those who hold to relativist views of ethics would say that, look, this is how it works. One culture will have vastly different views than another, or one individual will have vastly different views from another. So from that, they deduce that morality has to be subjective. It has to be relative to the individuals and to their cultures, because we don't see, a lot of similarity. We don't have the same values across different cultures. But in fact, we do have a general shape of what morality looks like. And so Ray in the book argues that the moral diversity stated by these kinds of systems is very overstated. You have cultures with a bottom line morality that C.S. Lewis traces in his book called The Abolition of Man, and we're actually going to look at those in that lecture about a case for objective morality. So I don't want to dive too far into that here, but Scott Ray quotes a guy named Sean McDowell in our textbook for the course. He says this: all societies have laws that protect human life. All condemn stealing, all honor courage, and all saying that engaging in sexual acts with just anyone is not permitted. It is as if many different orchestras are performing the same musical piece, but adapting the harmonics to fit their own instruments. So there is a general shape, and we'll discuss that more later, but he kind of touches on some key points. In every culture, there's been rules about protecting human life. You can't just kill whoever you want for any reason. There's consequences for that, and it's viewed as something that is actually wrong to do. Stealing is the same way. Dishonesty is also condemned. Virtues like honor, courage, those kinds of things are always held in high regard. And there's always rules in every culture about who you can and can't have a sexual relationship with. In most cultures, actually, as we'll see from C.S. Lewis, there's rules about a married person is off limits. And if you are engaging in these kinds of things with a married person, you've done something you should not do. If they're committed to somebody else and you do that, then you've broken the moral rules. And that's not something that's just like in the United States and like old school, 50s and 60s U.S. That's been a historical mark of human culture for a long time. And again, we'll back all that up with the sources in the next lecture. But to move on here, even if there is diversity of culture, and in some cases there are, and in some cases that another good example, a marriage is a good example here again. In some cultures, you can have 5 or 6 spouses. In some cultures, you can only have one. But there is a bottom line in each culture that the commitment that comes with marriage means that that person is exclusive to the person or people they are married to. So there's still some bottom line. We'll talk about that more in a moment. But even that diversity within cultures, if there is a diversity of opinion about morality, that does not prove that there is not some kind of higher virtue that transcends culture. It's clear, this is another quote from Scott Ray, he says, "It seems clear that diversity of practice does not necessarily equal diversity in underlying values or principles." So we don't disprove the fact that there is a greater morality by saying, well, some cultures do things differently. Well, we might practice it differently, but there's a bottom line rule that seems to be the same. So we do have a lot of commonality. The next point here, argument against. You get a big problem when you have cultures that clash or individuals that clash. What do you do when one country says, we think it's moral to exterminate another country? And you have the other country that says, well, we think it's immoral for you to exterminate our country. How do you decide who's right there? Well, if morality is relative, then you can't. You have a difference of opinion. And you'd have no way to solve it other than just might makes right. Whoever can win that fight is going to be the one that gets to decide what's right and wrong. The last point here is, I just put this in quotes. One of the arguments for, actually, or maybe not an argument for it, but at least a teaching of like a relativist view of ethics, is that it is immoral to impose moral absolutes. And if you think about that phrase for a moment, it is immoral to impose moral absolutes. That phrase itself is a moral absolute, isn't it? It's making an absolute statement about morality. It's always, in every case, it is immoral to do such and such action. But the action here is imposing a moral absolute. So in making this claim, you're actually doing the very thing you're saying is wrong by making this statement here. So to say that it's wrong to impose a moral absolute is kind of self-defeating. It can't be wrong to claim a moral absolute, because when we do, we take all the weight out from underneath morality in the first place. And we basically argue that, well, if you say you cannot have a problem with anyone's actions and say that is definitely morally wrong, then you've kind of dug yourself a hole from which you cannot say, with any ground to stand on at least, you can't say, well, that thing is wrong. Because basically what you should be saying is, that thing is different. And maybe back to the emotivism system, well, I just don't like it. So that's relativism. Egoism. This is all about just the one singular person and nobody else. The definition here is, it's determined by self-interest and self-preservation. Moral decisions are made by asking, what's in it for me, or what's best for me. And if this is the way we think about ethics, then our friend the shepherd, who's the ancestor of Gyges from that last lecture, then he does things right. He's the hero. And you have a character like Frodo from The Lord of the Rings. He would just be basically foolish for wasting his time worrying about trying to save the world around him, even at his own personal cost. This would say, if you have the chance, you need to seek for your best well-being, and if it's not good for someone else, then it's just tough. It's tough. They need to be seeking their best interest, so they'll do that themselves. I think you can probably see some of the appeal and the arguments against it just by its very definition. Arguments made in favor of egoism, though, people will say that this honors dignity over charity. So, and this is very closely tied to the second point of it, that egoism respects the importance of individual human life. So they say that, look, of all the ways of treating people, this makes the most sense because you don't treat people with charity, you treat people with dignity. And that's a different way to think of things. Guys, I'm sorry to do this, but let's take a quick break. I'm going to take like a 2 or 3 minute break, and I'll come right back.